What it do, baby boo? Hi, guys, and welcome and thank you for joining, clicking, reporting to the listener's doc for this podcast tonight. If you have gotten this far, then you probably already know. If you don't know, now you know. It's the highest, the flyest, non-biased, self-distributed podcast across the airwaves. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Bottom Line Podcast. My name is Davidson Baker. I would like to thank you once again for joining this podcast. Usually would be the time where I introduce myself and what I do. Staff writer at MMATakeover.com would be a familiar tune. Now host of a brand new show, Around the Cage. You guys can check that every Wednesday as part of the Loudmouth MMA Network, the Loudmouth MMA Podcast Network, rather. I did not lead off this podcast to say that because I loved writing for the Takeover. I loved it very much. However, the show must go on. And without giving too many details, I will say that today I officially became a member of the Fansided and Sports Illustrated MMA team. I'm very excited and don't want to obviously spend too much time, bragging about that. But it's an incredible honor and opportunity for me to continue to do what I love on a great platform. So you will, from here on out, be able to catch my work and all of the articles and contributions that I put out as a part of the Fansided and Sports Illustrated umbrella. So, okay. We are here tonight. It's about 10:45 p.m. local Eastern Standard Time here in Toledo, Ohio. Friday night on the eve of a pay-per-view offering from the UFC, as well as the inaugural European Series event by Bellator MMA, Bellator Newcastle. So we have quite a bit to get to. I'll try to keep it as quick as I can, being that I am flying solo on this. I'm going to tweet out the link to this. All right, let's get started. So, obviously, the middleweight division back in full focus for tomorrow night, with the main event and co-main event being somewhat of a middleweight tournament, per se. And you don't normally say that, and that was the sentiment that we all felt going into UFC 230 for a while. A lot of the fights got mixed and mashed up and jumbled around due to injuries and thereafter. However, you had, was supposed to be Weidman and Rockhold and Jacare and Branch, which obviously turned into Jacare and Weidman. And you also had Adesanya and Brunson, of course. What's good about this, though, what's good about tomorrow's card is Dana White yesterday at the press conference. Now, I obviously understand the precedent of thinking behind, you can't go off whatever Dana White says, and you can't take for word granted. And time again, that's been proven to be the correct state of thought. However, I believe in this time when he says that the co-main event tomorrow night between Israel Adesanya and Anderson Silva, which I will get to, is a number one contender fight. I love that that is a thing. And I love that it's a thing for a couple of reasons. Sorry about that. Posting on social media. Now, we have begun to stray into a universe in MMA where it has become the norm for title fights to sometimes be just announced out of the blue, per se. Maybe not out of the blue. There are a lot of title fights where we know pretty much who the number one contender is going to be, know who they should be. But sometimes we get blindsided, man, and particularly in this division, being the middleweight division, when 40-plus-year-old number 14 ranked contender Dan Henderson got that shot against Michael Bisping in late 2016. I don't think anybody saw that coming. I know Michael Bisping kind of asked for it, and sure, he deserved it to get that win back from UFC 100. But I digress. Anyway, lots to get into. A 12-fight card from down under and a 15-fight card in Newcastle, which I'll touch on towards the end. I'm really only going to be highlighting the main card. It's pretty interesting storylines. It's a card that I don't think is getting a lot of love, and I think should. With a new deal being struck over there in the UK under Sky Sports and thereafter. So I will get to that. But obviously, we begin with the main event. And it feels good this time around. If those can recall, right after George St. Pierre defeated Michael Bisping to win the middleweight title last November, 2 Novembers ago, actually, a unification bout was there for the taking for George St. Pierre to take on Robert Whittaker. George St. Pierre obviously vacated the belt, thus promoting Robert Whittaker to undisputed champion. Shortly thereafter, they booked the incredibly exquisite-looking Perth Arena. I still marvel about how that arena looks this day. I mean, it just looks amazing. In Western Australia last February for UFC 221. Unfortunately for all of those in attendance and the fans there, Robert Whittaker had to pull out due to a plethora of health issues, thus opening the door for Yoel Romero to come in and supposedly win the interim middleweight title. However, that was not granted to him on that night, being that he missed weight. Anyway, my point here is it's nice to actually go into this pay-per-view with a true Aussie-bred headliner with a belt around his waist to show for it, and a worthy title challenger waiting in the wings for him. Not to say Luke Rockhold wasn't, and not to say Yoel Romero wasn't. More so, I'm really happy that this card feels a lot bigger this year than last year's February Australia offering, with an Australian UFC champion headlining the bill. That being said, Robert Whittaker 20-4 in the UFC, or 20-4 as a pro and 11-2 in the UFC, including an undefeated run as a middleweight. I want to shed some light too on a friend of mine, future Vanderbilt Commodore, Michael Fidel, who I consider a friend, that joined me on my Around the Cage episode, not this past week, but the week before. Excuse me. He tweeted earlier tonight, I'm not going to read it, so I'll just paraphrase it a little bit. He tweeted that he felt a sense of gratitude and happiness in the fact that Robert Whittaker and Kelvin Gastelum both are former welterweights that found themselves on the most important runs of their career, obviously, and respectively for both, a weight class up at middleweight. Neither of these guys are particularly huge middleweights either. Whittaker only standing at 6 feet. Kelvin Gastelum only standing at 5'9", and a lot of these middleweights, man, you see they are absolutely gigantic. So it's good to see that these guys moved up in weight and found a run that they have subsequently gone on to further their success. I thought that was cool, and I didn't think about that until I saw Michael tweet it. So, fight-wise, Whitaker and Gastelum's a great middleweight title fight. Whitaker, believe it or not, man, he won the interim strap at UFC 213 International Fight Week a couple years ago, 2017. We're nearing almost a year and a half. And for some reasons, parallel to giving the blame to the Robert Whitaker side of things, and some reasons to be put on other shoulders, this is Robert Whitaker's first middleweight title defense. And people are like, whoa, 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 whoa. Well, you look back. As I previously mentioned, captured the interim middleweight title, then had to sit out for a while. His fight with Rockhold was scrapped. Maybe forever, being that now Rockhold's moving up to 205, and Romero beat him, and thus set up the rematch between the two, where Yoel Romero missed weight again. Therefore, Robert Whitaker's win that night more or less in the eyes of UFC fans could count as a title defense, but in the etching of the history books does not go down as an official defense of his middleweight title, because Yoel Romero tipped the scales 0.2 pounds too heavy. So this will be Robert Whitaker's first title defense. And Kelvin Gastelum's first shot at a UFC title himself. People also tend to forget as well, while Gastelum did miss weight for his bout with Tyron Woodley at UFC, I believe 180 a few years ago, Woodley accepted the fight, and that fight went on, and Kelvin Gastelum was a scorecard away from beating Tyron Woodley, thus securing, I don't know if I can say this with any certainty, being that he missed weight by such an egregious amount. Maybe Dana White wouldn't have given him the title shot. However, he very well could have secured a welterweight title shot that night against then champion Robbie Lawler. But now Kelvin Gastelum has come to the realization of a shot at the title and doing it a weight class up. It's a really, really difficult fight to pick as well. I've dissected the two on tape a little bit throughout the week, and you probably have to imagine if the fight went to the ground, you'd probably give the slight edge to Kelvin Gastelum. The question is whether or not Kelvin Gastelum wants to take it there in the first place, or if he would just rather try to sit in the pocket and do what he does best, and that is load up that southpaw left hand, which he has found so much success with. I don't know, man. It's going to be very interesting. And predictions and picks for those that are just joining for the first time and have never listened to my podcast before, I will go through predictions and picks towards the end. Got a bit of a cough, too. Robert Whitaker, though, at about a minus 240, pretty interesting, given that he was just slightly lower on the betting spectrum as a favorite against Yoel Romero his last time out, which a lot of people were surprised about. But I digress. Moving on to the co-main event and what I was getting into earlier, it feels good to know that this is kind of a mini middleweight tournament, with obviously the winner of the main event capturing that shiny new controversial UFC belt, along with the winner of the co-main event, according to Dana White. And again, I say this again, I would not blame you for being the one in the room that stands up in the back and shouts, "But Dana, you can't always trust what he says." I get that. But I believe him this time around. You look at the other names towards the top in the middleweight division right now. Israel Adesanya, the red corner of this co-main event, ranked number 6 in the world. And Anderson Silva coming in at number 15 due to a random shuffle following his USADA incident. You take a look at everybody in front of Adesanya, You have Yoel Romero at number 1, who obviously has now had 2 shots at Whitaker. If he's going to realize another UFC title shot, you would have to imagine it's going to come at 205 pounds, as long as Whitaker is there. Then you have number 2, Luke Rockhold, who has stated that he's interested and probably will move up to 205 pounds. And also coming off a loss. Jacare Souza, who lost to Kelvin Gastelum truth be told, Jacare Souza wins that night in Rio, it could very well be him in a rematch with Robert tomorrow. However, he was 1 scorecard off. Then you have Gastelum at 4, and then Weidman coming off a loss at 5. So it is not far-fetched to believe and formulate that the winner of this co-main event, being that Israel Adesanya, would have the longest winning streak in the middleweight division in the UFC by a good margin, should he win tomorrow, out of that crop of names that I just mentioned. And obviously Anderson Silva, the consensus greatest middleweight to ever do it, and in some people's minds, the greatest fighter, regardless of weight class, to ever do it. Odds have been shifting a little bit this week as well. Israel Adesanya at some points in the week and weeks beforehand was looking out almost minus 675, minus 700. That number has tempered down a little bit to minus 525. Anderson Silva plus 410. The fact that Anderson Silva, regardless of how old he is now and regardless of what day and age we're in, and regardless of what matchup he was drawn, Anderson Silva being a 4-1 underdog is madness, man. Madness. And the sentiment going into this fight, largely by pretty much everybody, is obviously it's the old school versus the new school. It's Anderson Silva facing the clone he never realized he had. But I like Israel Adesanya coming out multiple times already and saying, I'm not Anderson Silva. He said it. Speaking of that aforementioned UFC 221 card, the last pay-per-view offering they had in Australia, that's where Adesanya made his debut. Adesanya TKO'd Rob Wilkinson, and I remember sitting there just in absolute amazement at what he was doing. He then picked up a win over Marvin Vettori 2 months later in April, kept busy by defeating Brad Tavares in the main event of his 3rd UFC fight. Tidbit, Israel Adesanya, one of 2 fighters in UFC history to headline a UFC event in only their 3rd fight with the company. The first one being this guy named Conor McGregor. I don't know if you've heard of him. But outclassed Brad Tavares in what was a masterful performance for 5 rounds. And then, of course, the starching of Derek Brunson in Madison Square Garden in November. Man, Israel Adesanya wins this co-main event. He will have gone from UFC debutant to middleweight title challenger in 5 fights in a year's time, approximately. That's incredible, man. And the talent he has would sure speak for the possibility of it, and so will the odds. As I said, minus 525 as we currently speak. So like I said, I'm not going to take too much time on this podcast tonight. I am running through this solo, so I'll go ahead and give out my picks. Starting with the main event, Robert Whitaker and Kelvin Gastelum. I do believe that Kelvin Gastelum, as I said before, holds the advantage if this fight does hit the ground. Now, how big of an advantage? I'm not particularly certain. But, man, I just can't. I picked against Whitaker in both Romero fights, and for me, I just can't do it again. I believe Robert Whitaker has that something special, and if Kelvin Gastelum were prompted to try to take the fight to the ground, Whitaker has just absolutely picturesque takedown defense, as indicated and shown in both of his Yoel Romero fights. I like Whitaker to kind of control the distance and pick his shots and avoid the big bomb coming from Gastelum. I like Robert Whitaker by 2nd round TKO. And I believe in his next fight, he's going to face Israel Adesanya, which, by the way, Whitaker versus Adesanya, that fight would obviously, and rightfully so, need to take place in the Oceanic region. Whether they want to do it in Australia or, particularly maybe they want to do it in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm speaking as if Israel Adesanya is an automatic win here, which he's not. But should both of the favorites in the main and co-main hold serve, we're going to get the biggest fight in the history of Australian and New Zealand and Oceanic MMA by, I mean, to say by miles would be an insult. I mean, that would be the biggest fight in the history of Aussie and Kiwi. Almost anything, man. Almost anything. I think that fight's bigger than Horn versus Pacquiao was. I do. No one will get screwed in the ending either because, you know, Jeremy Horn didn't win that fight. But I digress. I do like Israel Adesanya to win. I know a lot of people are probably picking him by KO, TKO. Now, let's get this straight as well. Israel Adesanya goes out and starches Anderson Silva in round 1. That would be, you know, your type of, oh, shit, type of moment for the up climb in this kid's career. As if people haven't already watched Adesanya inside the octagon and said, oh, shit, already. But I don't think he's going to finish Anderson Silva. I think Anderson Silva will survive to the final bell. It's great to see Anderson Silva back in a matchup where Chael Sonnen alluded to it this week on his YouTube channel. For the first time really in Anderson Silva's career, he's going to be facing a guy that has no intentions of taking him down. I believe Israel Adesanya, and I can say almost certainly Adesanya has no intentions of taking this fight to the ground. And rightfully so. He hasn't done so in any of his fights so far. And obviously with the kickboxing resume that he carries into it, one would not call that a surprise. But I do think Anderson Silva will be able to pick and land shots of his own as well. And I think it will be a competitive fight. And I think more than anything, I cannot wait. This has kind of been dubbed as the unofficial main event. Israel Adesanya this week has really been the focal point of, you know, stardom amongst this field of guys just because of his not brash, but, you know, outward and unique personality that people can attract to rather quickly. You know, you hear the guy speak and you're like, wow, man, incredibly intelligent guy and also a really easy guy to like. I will say that too, man. I mean, if you are just like, if you have already decided, like many people did when LeBron James came to the NBA and he rivaled Kobe Bryant for that many years and vice versa, you know, if you like LeBron, you don't like Kobe, and like you actually develop this hatred for guy. If you develop a hatred or a dislike for Israel Adesanya, I mean, what's wrong with you? Really? Such an easy guy to like, a funny, charismatic, incredibly talented guy. And I'll even foreshadow it now. I think if Adesanya and Whitaker or even Adesanya and Gastelum were to fight, I would pick Adesanya in either of those fights. I think this kid is getting ready to begin to blossom his career into something we will all remember for the rest of our lives. Going to kind of go bang, bang on the rest of the card. At bantamweight, kind of sucks that Hani Yahya, despite being 11-3 in the UFC, cannot get a guy in the top 15 to stare across the octagon at him. However, he's pretty much getting the next best thing in a guy that many people believe will be in that top 15 soon to come, in Ricky Simón. Hani Yahya, 11-3 in the UFC, making his 15th appearance for the company, 16th if you count the no contest with Johnny Bedford their first time around. Ended an accidental clash of heads. Ran that fight back in. Hani Yahya submitted him. And obviously, in case any of you don't know, that is what Hani Yahya is going to look to do. He's going to look for the single leg pretty much immediately. And I think that Ricky Simón will provide he'll definitely provide difficulty for Yahya to get the fight to the ground, given how solid and stern of a wrestling background he has. I just think it might be too much too soon for Simón because, like, if Hani Yahya gets the fight to the ground at any point, it's his world. And Ricky Simón will just be living in it, man. I could be wrong, and I might regret this, but I'm going to take Hani Yahya by second-round submission. I'm also taking Montana De La Rosa by second-round submission. She's at about -255 on the main card, number 14 ranked, 14th ranked women's flyweight in the world according to the UFC rankings. She'll be taking on Nadia Kassem, who I have to look this up. I mean, I believe is making her flyweight debut. I thought her UFC debut was at 115. It was at 115. Now moving up 10 pounds. This will be an exciting matchup, man. I think Nadia Qasim is believed to be the next big thing out of Australia as far as women's MMA is concerned, especially with a large majority, if not everyone, because I can't think off the top of my head if there are any more outside of Megan Anderson, Aussie fighters on the women's circuit in the UFC, other than, you know, formerly Alex Chambers and Beck Rawlings, who I believe are both now no longer with the company. Nadia Qasim is going to carry that flag. I do think, though, that Montana De La Rosa has the edge for sure in high-level experience. You look at Montana De La Rosa's record; it's only 9-4, not exactly flattering. However, you look at the girls that she's lost to. You know, she's got losses to Mackenzie Dern and Cynthia Calvillo on her record. Neither of those losses being, you know, losses to hang your head on whatsoever. She also was upended by Nico Montano on the Ultimate Fighter season 26. That fight did not count on her official record. I do like Montana De La Rosa to get the finish here in the second round by submission. She's minus 255. Qasim 5-0 will look to cash as a plus 215 underdog and run her record to 6-0 and also break in to those women's flyweight rankings. So interesting one at light heavyweight. Was supposed to be Jim Crute and Ryan Spann. Instead, it will be Jim Crute opposite smiling Sam Alvey. Get this, though, man. Sam Alvey getting ready to go into his 17th UFC appearance, 10-6. Across 3 weight classes, if you include the Ultimate Fighter. Fought at welterweight, middleweight. I don't know how the hell he got down to welterweight. When I heard in an interview earlier this week, he said he walks around sometimes as heavy as 230. I believe 225, 230. I can't remember. Maybe even 235, somewhere around there. But the fact he ever made welterweight, man, I mean, it is an absolute miracle. Alvey trying to bounce back from a TKO loss to Little Nog back in September. And Jimmy Crute, the light heavyweight standout from Australia, who made his way into the UFC via the Contender Series last summer and got his win in his debut back in December against Paul Craig. Crute is a minus 140 favorite at the moment. Sam Alvey at plus 120. Here's what, and I totally got off topic from what I was going to say originally. Sam Alvey, this is his 17th UFC appearance, opening up the main card on a pay-per-view. And why that's significant is because coming into this fight, let alone prelims, fight pass prelims, main cards, you name it, Sam Alvey in 16 UFC appearances had never fought on a UFC flagship numbered pay-per-view event. It had been all fight nights. That's amazing to me, man. That's amazing. I always thought, like, if I was in Sam Alvey's camp, I would have, you know, said to matchmakers, he's your typical, you know, anywhere, anytime. Oh, I want to go there. Oh, I'm going to take this on short notice. Sounds great. Type of fighter. Very fan-friendly type of fighter. But you'd have to think, man, at some point his camp had to say to Sean Shelby or Mick Maynard, hey, man, like, am I ever going to fight on a pay-per-view? And now after his original opponent, Gadzimirdad Antigulov, pulled out of their contest that was supposed to take place in Prague in a couple of weeks, Sam Alvey now finds himself opening up the main card of a pay-per-view against Jim Crute. I do like Jim Crute, though. I think Crute gets the fight to the ground. He showed tremendous grappling acumen in his debut against a really, really solid grappler in his own right in Paul Craig. I think if Crute gets the fight to the ground, Alvey's in trouble, and I see him doing it early. Then headlining the ESPN prelims, Devontae Smith, another 1-0 Contender Series alum, looks to make it 2-0. Looks to do it this time around in similar fashion to how his debut went when he KO'd Julian Erosa in just 47 seconds. He'll be taking on no longer known as Dong Hyun Kim, but Dong Hyun Ma, the maestro, not to be confused with the stun gun that fights at welterweight. Dong Hyun Ma opened up 0-2 in his UFC career. One of those 2 losses was a fight that should have got Fight of the Year considerations. If you ask me, it's one of the most slept on wars of all time. Him and Marco Polo Reyes at UFC 199. After that fight, he has not lost. He has won 3 straight and will look to make it 4. I don't think it happens, though. I like Devontae Smith. I like Devontae Smith by TKO, probably round 2 or 3. I'll go with 3. Now, in the featherweight division, Shane Young, part 2 of the trio from City Kickboxing out of Auckland, New Zealand. Part 1 being obviously Israel Adesanya. Shane Young coming off a fight of the night win over Rolando D in Singapore last summer. He will look to make it 2 in a row against Austin Arnett, who very well might be fighting for his roster spot. A lot of times when guys get signed to the UFC, they sign 4-fight deals. This is Arnett's 4th fight, and he's 1-2. Picked up losses against Corey Sandhagen, which, no one can blame him for, and Hakeem Dawodu, who, also no one can blame him for, a couple of killers, and then picked up a very, very much needed win in Argentina over Humberto Bandenay last November. I like Arnett to spring the upset here, plus 260. I think that he fights a distance and outpoints Shane Young, outpoints the kickboxer. I think Shane Young is going to be the aggressor in this fight. I think Arnett sits back at distance and picks him apart. I like Arnett definitely at a plus 260 price. Here's an interesting tidbit in the next fight. Part 3 of that aforementioned City Kickboxing trio. The newly minted number 15 ranked flyweight contender in the world, with flyweight, being what it is right now. Kai Kara-France coming off also a fight of the night performance and win over Elias Garcia in Adelaide in December. Makes the quick turnaround on somewhat home soil, being that he is from New Zealand, regional soil, against the UFC newcomer Raulian Paiva. Now, Kai Kara-France was almost at about a minus 315, minus 325 clip. Those odds have since come down to minus 225. I found that very interesting. A lot of late money somewhat coming in on Raulian Paiva, which intrigues me a lot, being that Kara-France on relative home soil and coming off the performance that he put together in December. I like Kara-France here. I think he gets it done by decision. Would suck for Raulian Paiva to be cut after 1 fight in his UFC debut, but that seems to be the route that they're going with these flyweights, man. They're basically fighting for their job every time out. It's pretty sad, but nothing we can do about it. At bantamweight, Teruto Ishihara, who is going to look to get back on track. Last seen also in Singapore, losing to the now 14th ranked bantamweight contender Petr Yan. It was Petr Yan's debut. Petr Yan has since fought twice then, and Ishihara is back for the first time since against South Korea's Kyung-ho Kong, who also, like his South Korean counterpart, Dong Hyun Ma, began his UFC tenure winless in 2 tries and has since won 3 straight. And I like Kyung-ho Kong here as well. I like him to get the job done by submission. The easiest pick on the card for me has got to be Lando Venata. I'm not certain about this, and this is not a fact. It could be, but this is speculation that has wheels behind it from people I trust. Lando Venata's opponent, Marcos Mariano, Anderson Silva is the reason he's on this card. Marcos Mariano is 6-4, making his UFC debut. You do not see very often guys come into the UFC with a record of 6-4. Usually they also have longer winning streaks than one. He has won 4 of his last 5. And he's also 32, 6'2", man, fighting at lightweight. From what I understand and the rumor that is going around, part of Anderson Silva's, because face it, you're the UFC and you're getting ready to approach Anderson Silva to fight Israel Adesanya. You can promise the title shot all you want, and sure, that's an attractive byproduct of the offer you're making. However, I believe, and sources that I trust also believe, that Anderson Silva's dying request to be put on this card, in addition to the title shot, was for his teammate Marcus Mariano to be on this card as well. So here we are. Lando Venata has had one of the more eventful and interesting UFC tenure so far. He made his debut on very short notice against, just Tony Ferguson, a killer in Tony Ferguson. Hurt him badly and almost won the fight. Then spinning wheel kick KO'd John McDessie in his next fight, and has not won since, with 2 losses and 2 draws. Bobby Green, and one of those losses being a Fight of the Year contender last year against David Tamor. So I think Venata picks up a relatively easy win here. Another guy I think will probably make easy work of his fight, coming off a loss, needing a win, is Jalen the Tarantula Turner. He made his UFC debut last October on the Khabib and Conor undercard, up at welterweight against Vicente Luque. Why that fight was made, I have no idea. Jalen Turner, a natural lightweight, even though he's huge. I think he's at like 6'3". I was very impressed with him in his win over a guy that I interviewed subsequently after, Max Mustaki, on the Contender Series this past summer. Did not get the contract, but obviously got the short notice call to fight Luque, and he was KO'd in round 1. He said it this week too, man. No more fights at 170, and I don't blame him. He gets the UFC newcomer Callan Potter, who is at a plus 175 price tag at the moment. I like Jalen Turner in this fight. I think he keeps the distance. I think he's been there, done that, seen what it's like to be on the big show. I think he gets it done. First fight of the night, maybe one of the least anticipated fights, period, in the UFC this year. Walidi Buren takes on Jonathan Martinez. Buren 0-2 in the UFC, Martinez 0-1 in the UFC. You'd have to imagine a loss for Buren here secures his walking papers. And Jonathan Martinez 9-2, coming off a debut last October in which he was outpointed by Andre Sukumta. I like Jonathan Martinez here. I did a lot of research on him for my Octagon Jitters piece for that UFC Moncton fight week. And I think Martinez is just an overall, all-around better fighter, and I like him to get the job done. So, yeah, going to be awesome, man. It's a really, really undervalued card, in my opinion. I think a lot of people just look at the main, co-main, and see the rest of the bill and kind of shrug their shoulders, but I think it's going to be an exciting fight card. Last year's card, while not flattering to the initial look, last year's card in Australia, that is, definitely delivered with a lot of action and violence. So, yeah, quickly touching on as well and making predictions for Bellator Newcastle takes place tomorrow. It will not be broadcasted live in the United States. You can catch the prelims on Bellator.com as well as the main card. You know, if you're an illegal stream type of guy, I shouldn't be giving out this information, but, you know, they're going to be broadcasting it live on Channel 5. So if you can find a stream for Channel 5 in the UK anywhere, that would be the go-to. That'll be going down at 10 p.m. local time in Newcastle, England, from the Metro Radio Arena, and 5 p.m. here in the East, 2 p.m. in the West. That's headlined by making his 21st Bellator appearance, Patricky Pitbull. Talk about a hell of a Bellator debut for his adversary. Former Bama lightweight champion Ryan Scope gets signed to Bellator, and they say, hey, you want to fight Patricky Pitbull? Sheesh, man. Sheesh. Pitbull probably stops him. Interesting co-main event, too. Really interesting co-main event, to be honest with you. Aaron Chalmers, for those who don't know, a guy that transitioned into MMA, did a lot of martial arts, and is known mostly and is basically a celebrity in the UK for being a part of the Geordie Shore cast. It's the Jersey Shore equivalent over across the pond. He made his Bellator debut last summer in London, a fight in which he won by technical submission, standing guillotine. I cannot even remember the guy's name that he fought. It was just, you know, some can that they got him in there for Chalmers to crush. A lot of people will think that that sentiment remains the same going into it was Ashley Griffiths. That was the guy's name. A lot of people will think that that is the case again going into this fight. However, Corey Browning, his opponent, 4-2, 1-0 in Bellator. He was kind of offered up as a sacrificial lamb in October in his first Bellator fight against the son of the late, great Kimbo Slice, Baby Slice. And Baby Slice spent a large majority of that first round looking for, I believe it was a guillotine. He was looking for a submission and just gassed himself out, and Browning took advantage of it. So Corey Browning has the opportunity to play spoiler for Bellator at the expense of Baby Slice and Aaron Chalmers in back-to-back fights. And I think he does it, man. I think Corey Browning, he showed in his last fight that he is definitely not one of these cans for higher profile personalities to crush. And I like Corey Browning in that co-main event. I think Aaron Chalmers will bounce back. He's a good story, but he's at plus 240 right now. That might change by the time anybody listens to this, but once again, I digress. Also in the lightweight, 3 lightweight fights and a middleweight fight. Terry Brazier, former Bama, I believe he was a 2-division champion. Trying to remember which divisions he reigned as champion in. Lightweight and welterweight. So former paratrooper, they did a feature on him on ESPN MMA on their YouTube page this week. If you haven't seen that yet, go check that out. Terry Brazier, 10-1, making his Bellator debut against the 13-4 Scotland bred Chris Bungard. I'm going to go with Brazier in that one. And then the main card opener, the brother of 9th-ranked UFC welterweight contender Leon Edwards, Fabian Edwards, who is 5-0 and fought in his professional debut under the Bellator banner before a 4-fight stint with Bama. He will take on the former Cage Warriors middleweight champion, Lee Chadwick. Another interesting fight there. Fabian Edwards right now, though, at minus 425, Chadwick plus 335, and I think Edwards gets him out of there early. So, yeah, interesting 4-pack of fights there that I wish was getting a little bit more respect across the pond in Newcastle tomorrow. But regardless, guys, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. It was a rather short one today, late night solo offering from myself. The plan is to be back next week. There is an absolutely loaded slate of MMA next week. Obviously, the UFC's debut on linear ESPN is next Sunday, headlined by Francis Ngannou and Cain Velasquez. The 2 nights preceding that, there are Bellator back-to-back events at the Mohegan Sun. Friday night's event headlined by Matt Mitrione and Sergey Kharitonov. And then Saturday, the big one, arguably the biggest fight in the history of British MMA. Michael Venom Page and Paul Daly will finally settle their differences. Number 1 contender fight in the co-main as well at heavyweight between Chet Congo and Vitaly Minakov, and then also Mirko Krokop and Roy Big Country Nelson on that card as well, amongst many other fights. Also, you have the Invicta flyweight title on Friday up for grabs between Vanessa Porto and Pearl Gonzalez. There's a lot of MMA to digest next week, and I believe that I will be joined by a guest next week. That guest is Mike Pendleton of bjpenn.com. He was supposed to come on tonight, but he was a little bit tired, a little bit under the weather. I told him don't worry about it. If you're listening to this, Mike, right now, don't worry about it, brother. And I will see you guys next week. Thank you very much. Once again, thank you for supporting. And as I stated at the beginning of the podcast, going forward, you'll be able to find my work and journalism efforts at Fansided and under Sports Illustrated MMA, something I'm very excited to be a part of and really can't wait to get after. So until next time, guys, thanks a lot for listening to this podcast, and I hope to see you guys next week.